there is one story that digs right into my core, and that is the 60 Minutes segment that has been going around. So on Sunday, 60 Minutes ran a segment featuring the infamous Doomsayer, Paul Ehrlich, talking about the coming sixth mass extinction for life on Earth. Paul Ehrlich, you might know for his famous book in 1968 titled The Population Bomb, where he predicted that the world was going to soon run out of food and lead to the deaths of hundreds of millions of people in the 70s and 80s, which I'm not sure if that happened. Pretty sure it didn't.
Were any of us alive in 1968, by the way? Jim, were you alive in 1968?
I was not alive in 1968.
Okay.
The most surprising thing out of the 60 Minutes clip segment was the fact that Paul Ehrlich is still alive. I truly did not know that.
Amen, brother.
Yeah.
But
90 years old.
I'm just going to give a very brief rundown of how this 60-minute thing's played out. So it starts off with the heartfelt story of a fisherman not being able to fish the waters that his families have fished for generations and generations and all of that. And how this reduction in biodiversity is changing his way of life for his family and his community and all of that.
It always starts that way.
Yes.
Of course, the gut-wrenching story. Yeah, a lot of this was like pure media 101 type stuff. So then it goes to Paul Ehrlich, who says, too many people, too much consumption, and growth mania. And then the narrator of it, whoever the journalist for this whole thing was, says, by the age of 90, Scott Pelley says, biologist Paul Ehrlich may have lived long enough to see some of his dire prophecies come true, which is hilarious to me because the only times we've ever talked about him is when his prophecies fall on their face, which is 98.5% of the time. But sure, maybe he got it right 1.2% of the time. So that goes back to Paul Ehrlich saying, no, humanity is not sustainable. To maintain our lifestyle, yours and mine, basically for the entire planet, you'll need 5 more Earths. Not clear where they're going to come from, he jokes. So then the Scott Pelley says, just in terms of resources that would be required. And then Paul Ehrlich says, resources that would be required, the systems that support our lives, which of course are the biodiversity that we are wiping out. Humanity is very busily sitting on a limb that we are sawing off. So then it talks about his book, The Population Bomb, and how he was wrong about that, but how he's been right about a whole bunch of other stuff, supposedly. It says the rate of extinction is extraordinarily high now and getting higher all the time. This is what Paul Ehrlich says. So then it goes to a couple of other guys talking about how we're facing the sixth great extinction, and how 75% of everything is gone in terms of land and water. We're inhabiting all of this stuff, and birds that were once plentiful are gone, all of these different things. It talks about potential solutions before talking a little bit about the UN Biodiversity Conference, which we're going to get into later. And then back to Paul Ehrlich, who's asked about the lack of political willpower to act on these dire predictions. And he says, I know there is no political will to do any of the things that I'm concerned with, which is exactly why I and the vast majority of colleagues think that we've had it, that in the next few decades will be the end of the kind of civilization that we're used to. So that's the meat of it. There's a few more aspects of it that I kind of left out of my explanation for this. But I want to go to Jim first of what your initial reactions were to this 60-minute segment.
We laugh at this because it's absurd and it's funny. We should laugh. And mockery is a great counter to this sort of thing, because Paul Ehrlich has been wrong. He's been wrong about, I would just say, it's safe to say you'd easily round up to 100% of the time he's been wrong. He said in 1970, so that's the year I was born, most of the people who are going to die in the greatest cataclysm in history of man have already been born. So, all right, I'm 52 years old. I guess I'm not long for this earth. He said that we were going to have food shortages and that basically humanity would depopulate itself because we would run out of food. And when watching this segment on 60 Minutes, Scott Pelley actually mentions that, a lot of the predictions in Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb book did not come true, especially on agriculture. But he called it, like the green revolution in agriculture has made it so that we can feed ourselves. But he just breezed right by that as if that was just no big deal. It's like, dude, Paul Ehrlich said we were all going to starve to death. He said that there was no way we'd be able to grow enough food to keep ourselves alive, and that we wouldn't be able to raise, farm animals. We would starve to death. Billions of people would just wither away and die. That's what he said. And he said that 50 years ago. And you put him on the number one television news program in America, The Legacy, probably the most respected. We don't respect it because, it's 60 Minutes and it's the leftist corrupt media, but millions of people watch and trust 60 Minutes. Millions and millions of people have listened to this, and we think it's absurd and we laugh, but a lot of people don't. And we have raised at least two generations of children who are like Greta Thunberg, who are terrified that humanity is going to go extinct, that we are actually destroying the planet and the ability of plants and animals to exist on this planet, and that Earth is just going to slough off humanity because we are exploiting all of these resources. This sort of alarmism, this mania, it seeps into the culture, and it actually drives policy. We are embarking on a suicide mission when it comes to getting rid of fossil fuels, to get to net zero. And the underpinning of all of it is this doomsday stuff, that if we don't act now, we are all doomed. It's a lie. And for Scott Pelley of all people, Paul Ehrlich, the guy who has been wrong about every prediction for 50 years, and you put him on your program and present him to the American people, and you don't utter a syllable of pushback on his predictions, either in the past or now. The thing that's really frustrating is that there are a lot of people who listen to that, who trust 60 Minutes, and who think that, Paul Ehrlich is right. Why else would they have him on 60 Minutes if he wasn't right? That's the real tragedy.
In the early 2000s, I was an avid viewer of 60 Minutes because they actually did really good investigative reporting. They always had both sides of the argument. On this one, they had Paul Ehrlich, who was followed by his Stanford colleague and a bunch of other people who are just hyping the same thing. So they have just lost all credibility. They do not present both sides of the issues. They are just an echo chamber. So just want to get that out of the way. I've lost all respect for 60 Minutes. And then on this one, this was really about the 6th mass extinction event. A lack of biodiversity is creating a situation in which we are going to see a mass extinction event, unlike that seen since when the dinosaurs died 66 million years ago. Every single other mass extinction event in history has been from volcanoes or from asteroids or those kind of things. They've been natural. They're claiming that this is all man-made. And of course, they're saying that green renewable energies is going to be the solution to all this. But Donnie, like you said, they're also saying that there are just too many people on this earth. So they are definitely coming into this with a anti-human perspective. And I think that really does need to be said. And I think that needs to be said clearly. They are anti-human. They are unwilling to accept the fact that the more humans we have, the more innovation we have, the more ideas we have, the more cooperation we have, the more collaboration we have, the more humans we have in general, the better things are. And if anything, we're actually in a population decline. The birth rate in most Western countries is falling. So if anything, we should be sounding the alarm for the exact opposite problem. But that would not go with what Paul Ehrlich and people in his ilk want, which is less humanity.
When I first started seeing this going around, I think I first saw people talking about the 60 Minutes thing on Twitter, and it was being talked about as like this climate change alarmism. And I think I introduced this at the top of the podcast as climate change alarmism taking center stage. But when you get like 5 minutes into this video, it becomes very clear that this was not about climate change. I think they referenced climate change once during this whole 15-minute segment. Yeah. This whole thing, and this is my biggest takeaway from this 60 Minutes segment, is that it was all population control rhetoric. That's what it was from beginning to end. Even if we were to, have some breakthrough and all the free energy and all of this stuff, that's still not going to stop us from expanding and building more houses and consuming more food and doing all of these different things. So the idea of replacing, reliable fossil fuels with unreliable wind and solar, it's going to do nothing to solve the problems that are being pointed out in this 60 Minutes, this 60 Minutes segment. So Justin, do you concur with that, or do you think this is just part and parcel of climate change?
Yeah, no, I think that's the most interesting thing. I mean, when you think about the thing that I like about Paul Ehrlich, I always find myself in this situation where I'm liking all these crazy people. The thing that I like about these crazy people on the left is that they are logically consistent with what they take their fundamental beliefs, and then they logically they move forward with policy that they think will accomplish their goals that are related to their fundamental beliefs. Okay. A lot of people on the left don't do that. Like that's one of the biggest issues with sort of renewable energy as we understand it, so-called renewable energy, windmills and solar panels and all this stuff, is that it actually won't do the things that they claim that it will do. So even if you believe that there is a crisis, that wouldn't solve the crisis. So the thing that I like about Paul Ehrlich and Michael Moore, and there's other people that are kind of in this camp, I think it's actually growing in recent years, is they're at least intellectually, they're honest. They're crazy, but they're honest, and they are logically consistent. And so that really is one of the most important parts of all of this is if you actually believe in this sort of mass extinction thing, which people on the left are talking about all the time, then yeah, you need fewer people. That's what you need. You need fewer people. That it's not about more solar panels. That's not going to solve the problem. You need fewer people. And in fact, and we've been talking about this for many years, Donnie, right? The worst thing that can happen from Paul Ehrlich's perspective is that we find some sort of
unobtainium.
Yeah, we find some perfect source of energy. We find a perfect source of energy that creates no problems at all and powers everything efficiently and affordably and everything. That's the worst thing that could happen from these people's perspective, because that means unlimited economic growth. That means more human expansion. That means more people building more cities and all this. And they will never... That's not something that they want. That's something Paul Ehrlich is very clear. He does not want that. See, so there's that part of it, I think, is so important for people to understand that fundamentally the people, how you can tell when you're talking about people who are alarmists, you can tell the true believers from the hucksters by looking at how radical their solutions are for the radical problem that they say is plaguing the world. If they're saying we're all going to die, but their solution is more solar panels, that they're not real. They don't or they don't understand at all what they're talking about. But the people who take it seriously will say things like this. And that's what's so scary, is that at some point in time, does that transition happen where it's like, you know what? Actually, we just need fewer people. The windmills and solar panels, that didn't do the job. We need fewer people. And I fear that is the direction that we're headed in, because we see this in Paul Ehrlich and people like that. And we've seen it for decades now.
Well, Donnie, that trend is also continued with AOC and Bernie, who are saying, oh, climate change is going to be such a disaster. In 12 years, we're all going to die. Don't have children. This is becoming a mainstream talking point on the far left. And it's really sick. It's anti-human. It's disgusting.
Yeah, just really real quick about that, because it struck me the beginning of the story is because this is how they always do it, right? It's we gonna draw people in with some heartbreaking story of somebody suffering, and if only we were just doing whatever this expert that we're about to talk to suggests, then this person that we showed you at the beginning of this, he may not be suffering, but it's like the real radical environmentalists like Paul Ehrlich, that guy wouldn't on the boat. He wouldn't be suffering because he wouldn't exist. He wouldn't live. He wouldn't be alive. He wouldn't be here. He wouldn't have been born. That's what Paul Ehrlich wanted. So like the anti-humanist aspect of the radical environmentalism, we're not talking about your run-of-the-mill person who just wants to have, some conservation efforts and likes to save pandas and whales and whatever. We're not talking about those people. We're talking about the real hardcore policy people, the people at the NRDC and places like that, Paul Ehrlichs of the world, Michael Moore. These people understand that in order to accomplish their goals are radical. In order to accomplish them, you need less people. And in order to have less people, you can persuade them, you can try to convince them, incentivize them, coerce them, propaganda might work, I don't know. But at some point, if people are still having more people, we got to do something about that. And that kind of stuff is so terrifying, but they're very honest about it. And if you take them seriously, as we do, it's a scary road that we're headed down.
Paul Ehrlich predicted in 1971, he gave a speech this must have gone over great in the United Kingdom, where he said by the year 2000, the United Kingdom will simply be a small group of impoverished islands inhabited by some 70 million hungry people. If I were a gambler, I would take even money that England will not even exist in the year 2000. That's what he had said in 1971.
Dang it. Unfortunately, he was wrong on that one.
He was wrong on
I'm
that
kidding,
one.
English fans. I'm joking.
That's right. In April 1970, he said that people are going to be starving because we won't be able to make enough food. And he said the death rate will increase until at least 100 to 200 million people per year will be starving to death during the next 10 years. So before 1980, he predicted that 100 to 200 million human beings would starve to death every year. Scott Pelley himself should have been throwing this stuff in his face and said, you were so spectacularly wrong, not just a little wrong, spectacularly wrong. He could have at least an honest journalist would do that. But Scott Pelley in 60 Minutes, Scott Pelley is not an honest journalist. 60 Minutes is not an honest journalist program. It's a propaganda outfit. And the propaganda they are pushing is this anti-human evil. It's evil. It's an evil anti-human agenda that is being pushed. It's to condition us to look at each other, our fellow human beings, as a plague. It's kind of like what happened with COVID. We were conditioned by our governments and by our culture and by our news programs to look at each other not as human beings with wants and desires and the ability to love and a soul, but to look at each other human being as a walking vestige of pus and disease. If biodiversity is going to collapse here because there's too many humans on it, what is the solution to that? The solution is obviously, and what they say is fewer people. And so you are conditioned now to look at your fellow human being as somebody who shouldn't be there. They shouldn't even be alive. It is devaluing the value of a human being. That's ultimately what this is really about. But it's just this anti-human message that is just so evil. And it's just being pushed with no pushback. There's nobody standing up for the sanctity, frankly, of life and the value of human beings.
There's people in the World Economic Forum, people like Bill Gates that are talking about populations getting too big. And yes, sometimes these quotes are taken out of context, but they're still talking about population control. We have a clip of Jane Goodall, who, again, like Paul Ehrlich, surprised that she's still alive. But here's Jane Goodall talking at the World Economic Forum, referencing population. Go ahead.
Hide away from human population growth because it underlies so many of the other problems. All these things we talk about wouldn't be a problem if there was the size of population that there was 500 years ago.
Yeah, the size of the population 500 years ago was less than 1 billion. Just to put that in a little bit of context.
Things were so much better 500 years ago, weren't they?
Yeah, right.
They were so much better back then.
Yeah, the population of the world in the year 1500 was 438 million people. A full quarter of all human beings on the face of the earth were living in China. And so basically Europe, is basically depopulated. And to achieve this, the only way we're going to be able to sustain the rest of the ecosystems of the earth is basically to get rid of 7 out of every 8 people on earth, according to Jane Goodall, who, again, nobody at this, she's giving it, of course, at the World Economic Forum, where doomsaying is like the corn of the realm there, right? I can't even imagine. We didn't play the clip long enough, but how can somebody be interviewing her and not go, sorry, what was that? What was that? We have to kill and get rid of 7 out of every 8 people.
Did you say 500 years? Did you mean 50?
Well, let me. What was that again? And so, yeah, it's this idea that, as you mentioned, there's all these things we can do to make sure, as we start to depopulate the planet, because let's be clear, the World Economic Forum and all of these global leaders and elites really do think there are too many people on Earth. Not them. No, there's plenty of them. They want to be able to live, but there's so many of us other, mouth breathers and consumers and eaters who just need to
useless eaters, they call
useless them. Eaters. That's right. It's called a conspiracy theory if you start to point out the logic of their own policies.